Hello, my name is Alec Feather, and I'm a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. The Dole Student Advisory Board is comprised of KU students committed to the bipartisan mission of the Dole Institute. Members of the SAB receive many great opportunities, and if you are a student who would like to join, then please contact the Dole Institute. If you enjoyed this evening's program, please let us know by contacting us on Facebook, Twitter, or through our website's email. Hearing assistance is available, and we have a loop seating section at each program designated by the sign. If you have any questions about the loop, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members or student volunteers. Before we begin tonight, I would like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. After the interview, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student helper with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. And now, please welcome Director William B. Lacey.
Thank you very much. I do not remember, Alec, the last time I was introduced as William B. Lacey, but that's greatly appreciated. I want to thank all of you for coming. I know the weather has just been terrible, and we're delighted that it broke a little bit and you could join us tonight. And I wanted to tell you this will be the first of our three program book series that we're doing. We'll have, and I think this will be on the back of your program, we'll have Ira Shapiro here to talk about his book about the United States Senate in a couple of weeks. And then we will, in early April, have Major Garrett back at the Dole Institute. He appeared in our 2008 post-election conference, but he'll be back at the Institute talking about his new book, Mr. Trump's Wild Ride. So we would encourage you to join us for all three of those. And the bookstore is here tonight, and they're selling all three books, so you can pick them all up. And this is the book that we'll be discussing tonight. Let me just say that I am delighted to host my good friend and former White House colleague, Mark Weinberg. He's a former speechwriter and advisor to President Reagan. He served as a special assistant and assistant press secretary in the White House. He was director of public affairs for the president's post-presidency office, and he's had a number of other very interesting and significant roles in corporate and political communications. And I am so delighted that he can join us tonight. Please welcome Mr. Mark Weinberg. Mark, it's great to see you again. Let's start with some info so they get to know you a little bit better. Tell us a little bit about your upbringing and education and how you got into politics.
The short answer is I was interested in politics as a teenager for no particular reason. My family was not political, is not political. I just was interested in it. And I went to college at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. intentionally and took advantage of the proximity to political organizations and institutions and became involved with political things there. Through Hugh O'Neill, who is here, who was my first real boss in politics, so you can blame him if the evening doesn't go very well. And then I went to college at George Washington University, studied journalism. I then went to work for the John Connally presidential campaign. I don't know how many people here know John Connally. In 1979, he ran for president. He's a former governor of Texas, former Secretary of the Treasury, was in the car with JFK when he was killed, and he ran for president in 1979 and early 1980 against Ronald Reagan in the Republican primary, and I went to work as an intern in the Connally campaign. Shortly after I got there, Connally hired a fellow by the name of Jim Brady to be his press secretary. And long story short, Reagan won all the primaries, Connally withdrew, and Brady and I ended up at the Reagan campaign in 1980. Reagan won. Brady became the White House press secretary and took me with him into the Reagan White House press office. So that's how I ended up there.
Okay, very good. Now tell us about the different positions that you held for President Reagan, including the White House and including post-presidency.
Right. The first position I held in the Reagan operation was in the 1980 general election campaign as a traveling press aide. And I was part of the press office, and I was assigned to the Reagan campaign airplane after he was nominated in August of 1980, along with a number of other people. And I had two responsibilities. One was to, as we were flying from city to city, to sit at a typewriter and listen to a recording of what he had said informally at rope lines or getting in and out of cars, or not the speech, but those little Q&As that he had with reporters throughout the day, and typing up a transcript of those as we were between cities so that they could later be Xeroxed and handed out to the press when they wanted to know what he had said in response to a question. And then the other was to do whatever the press secretary, who at that time was a fellow by the name of Lynn Nofziger, said needed to be done for the traveling press corps. In the Reagan general election campaign of 1980, we had two airplanes. One was the candidate's plane, on which he and most of the senior staff and a fair number of junior staff flew. The Secret Service flew, and a large number of press. There was also a second plane, a press plane, that looked identical to it, and we had a large press contingent. I was assigned to the candidate's plane and ran up and down the aisles distributing papers and speeches and things and whatever else you do during a campaign. One of the things I learned in a campaign is everybody does everything. Then, when Reagan was elected, I worked in what they called the Office of the President-elect. It was essentially the transition office that the Reagan team operated in Washington between Election Day and Inauguration Day, where Jim Brady was based. And I wrote press releases announcing cabinet appointments and other senior staff appointments and other duties as assigned. In the White House press office, I was an assistant press secretary in charge of coverage arrangements, which meant taking photographers in and out of the Oval Office, the cabinet room, the East Room. It meant working with the advanced staff on arrangements for coverage of events at and away from the White House, whether it was Washington, D.C., or New York, or Moscow, or wherever. My responsibility was to deal with the resident White House press corps having access to the president in the way that was determined for them to have. I also ended up going with the Reagans to Camp David on weekends to be the press aide in attendance. That was the 8 years in the White House. And then after, when he became a former president, they asked if I wanted to come to California and be the press secretary. The former title was Director of Public Affairs, but what that job meant in the office in Los Angeles was the spokesman, the speechwriter, the personal aide, the media advisor, and again, whatever else needed to be done, because it was a very small staff in Los Angeles in what some called retirement. So those are the various positions. After I left the Reagan's employ, after 10 plus years, I remained a consultant to the Reagan Foundation.
Okay. Now tell us why you wrote this book.
I don't know. I never intended to write a book. It just never occurred to me that I had a book to write. And the truth of the matter is that there are an awful lot of books about Ronald Reagan written, and there are still more being written. And it just never occurred to me. I mean, I had an interesting experience, and I enjoyed it, and it was fun, but it just didn't occur to me that I should write a book. What would I say? I mean, I had no kiss and tell. I wasn't involved in the negotiations with Gorbachev to reduce arms, and I didn't negotiate with Senator Dole on tax reform. I was a witness to a lot of things, but what would I say? Does the country really need another book about Ronald Reagan? And then a few years ago, everybody was writing books at various points about him, and my wife said to me, "Well, you should write a book too." And I said, "Well, what would I?" As I just said, "What would I write about?" She said, "Well, you were the only person who saw the campaign all 8 years in the White House and post-presidency, and went to Camp David with them virtually every weekend for 8 years and on every trip. And you have that unique perspective of them behind the scenes at Camp David as they watched movies. That story has never been told by anyone. And by the way, honey, you're the only person who can tell that story." I said, "You know something, you're right." And she said, and by the way, it's the only story you can tell. So I went from here to there, but I gave it some thought and thought, well, maybe there is something that can be added, a piece of the puzzle that has not yet been seen, that can give a glimpse into their private life on those weekends. Because you know what would happen, and you probably all saw this, on Friday afternoons, they'd get in the helicopter, go to Camp David, and essentially disappear for 48 hours. And a lot of people wonder, well, what was that like? What did they do? And what was it like to watch movies with them? And I thought, well, maybe there is something here. So I did some research. I went and found out the names of all the movies that we saw over the 8 years, 300 and some odd movies over the 8 years. Every weekend that they weren't traveling or didn't have an event, they would go to Camp David and we would watch movies. So I made a list of all the movies and all the dates and everybody else who was there. And I sent that to some publishers saying, I'm going to write a book called Weekends at Camp David. And I got a couple publisher letters back saying, we just don't see it. That's interesting. I'm sure it was wonderful memories, but it's really not for us. And then someone said, you're doing this wrong. You need an agent, a literary agent. I didn't even know there were such things. I knew about talent agents, of course, from the Reagans, but I didn't know there were literary agents whose job it is to form a proposal that publishers will buy. And in fact, some of the big houses won't take unsolicited manuscripts. It has to come through an agent. So I found an agent in Washington, actually in Alexandria, Virginia, some fellows who were veterans of the Bush administration who were just starting out and becoming quite well known, and I gave them my idea for the book called Weekends at Camp David. And they came back and said, well, we'll represent you, but this isn't a book, this is a list. And I said, yeah, I know. And they said, well, that's 4 pages. You need 70,000 words. I said, well, what am I going to write about? And they said, well, what do you remember from watching those movies with them? And how can we use those movies to act as a springboard to stories, to anecdotes, to observations and revelations that have not previously been shared, that relate to the movies as they were watching them. So you have 2 tracks. You have this famous Hollywood couple watching movies every weekend, engaging their reactions to them and all of the things that entailed and how evocative that was of their own history, and how you could use the movies as a springboard to offer commentary and observations on aspects of the Reagan presidency and what was going on in the country at the time. And then with that as the guide, we picked out the iconic movies of the 80s with a few golden oldies mixed in and used those as springboards for each chapter to share an observation or an anecdote or both that was unique to my experience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And go into that a little bit more, because I wanted you, the organization, excuse me, the organization of the book is very, very unique. Tell them precisely how you organize it and why you decided to do that.
Well, once, as I say, we had this list of 300 and some odd movies, and you had to boil it down and come up with the ones that were most iconic, that were of the 80s, or were related to the Reagans, such as the Gipper story or Hellcats of the Navy, or something that had a very personal connection to them, or was a movie about which there was a particularly vivid or telling memory, or a movie that could logically lead to a broader discussion. So for example, several of the movies about communism and Russians would logically lead to a broader discussion of Reagan's relationship with Gorbachev. Or one of the movies about Britain would logically lead to a conversation or some stories about his relationship with the royal family. Or On Golden Pond would naturally lead to some discussion of his role as a father with an estranged daughter. So we looked at movies and said, or Oh God, Book 2 could talk about him and religion and superstition and other stories. So what movies here that are not only emblematic of the 80s, but also lead to a discussion, hey, as long as we're talking about science fiction, did you know that Ronald Reagan this or Ronald Reagan that? So that was the theory, and organized each chapter around a movie as a starting point for a broader discussion.
Tell everyone, and you and I were talking about this, but talk to our guests tonight about what President Reagan was like, what he was like to be with, to work for, and just to be around when he was in his more casual time.
Well, he was delightful, and he was exactly what you would expect. There were not two Ronald Reagans. What you saw was what you got. I was new to the entourage in 1980 and had not known him or her at all, and I had read all of the things about their relationship and thought, is it really like this? I mean, it seems a little bit much, what you read. And then I saw them off camera, behind the scenes, at Camp David, and they were exactly the way that I had read and had been portrayed and had seen. There was nothing fake about it. They held hands when they were in private, there were no cameras and no stage on which to pretend. They whispered to each other. They enjoyed each other's company. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't swear. He didn't yell or demand. He had a great sense of humor. He was very appreciative and kindly. She was very protective of him, but it was exactly what you had seen. And that was both surprising and reassuring, because there were not two people that, okay, once we're behind closed doors, there's a very different guy than what you see on TV or making a speech or in an interview. And he was unfailingly courteous, unfailingly kind, genteel and chivalrous. I think, old school is the thing that comes to mind. Did this come out?
Yeah, the microphone came off.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I've had the same problem, so.
Am I doing it right? We're doing it. It was that. Were people able to hear that part of it? Okay.
Okay. I want to get into the book and the movies, but before I do that, I'm curious about this because I was never at Camp David, and all the time I was on the White House staff, so I think this might be something everybody else is interested in. What was Camp David like, and what was their weekend at Camp David like? You just reminded me. I knew this at the time, but I'd forgotten how often they went up there. But they went up there, like you say, almost every weekend that they didn't have official business.
If they didn't have something to do in Washington or were not traveling, they would go. 3:30, usually on Friday afternoons, the helicopter would come and take them, and they'd come back at a similar time on Sundays. And I had mixed feelings about Camp David the first time I got there. I said, wow, this is it? And then it's like, this is it? Because it's kind of the anti-White House. It's designed, I would not call it rustic, but I similarly would, it's not fancy. It's comfortable and casual, and there are cabins. They stayed in a residence called Aspen Lodge, and it's a very comfortable, nicely appointed ranch house that has 3 bedrooms and a living room and a dining room and a sitting area by a fireplace, but plaid fabrics, and there's a pool in the back and a nice terrace. But it's nothing opulent, nothing fancy. It's just a nice weekend home. And the cabins that the staff stayed in were modest. They were green in color and had nice furniture, probably Haywood Wakefield, something of that kind, but nothing fancy. And the staff ate in a big building called Laurel Lodge, which had an office for the president, a cabinet room for meetings, and a dining room and a living room, and people ate there in fireplaces. It was, a camp, a retreat. And the Reagans liked to take walks. It was as unspoiled as you could get in the Catoctin Mountains. A lot of trees and nature and things of that kind. They liked to take walks together. They would horseback ride. They brought up, the National Park Service would bring up horses on the weekends if the weather was good, and they would trail ride in the Catoctin Mountains. They would sit out by the pool every Saturday and part of Sunday if the weather was good. They both enjoyed just sitting out at the pool. Occasionally the president would swim, but often they would just sit outside and enjoy the sun. They didn't play tennis. They didn't jog. They didn't snowmobile or bowl. They would sit in their living room and he would read or write speeches. Mrs. Reagan would read or talk on the phone. They would watch news shows and have dinner together, and they would just unwind. They didn't nap. At least he didn't. But the horseback riding, the walks, the swimming, and the just sitting with their feet up and doing work or watching TV and then movies after dinner was their usual routine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, if you had to pick, and I want to spend a little while on your book and the movies, but if you had to pick one or two films that you thought had the greatest impact on the president, what would you pick?
I wouldn't pick any of them that had an impact, and I'll tell you why. He didn't watch movies for impact. He watched them to be entertained, purely entertaining. He watched the movie, he enjoyed the movie, and that was that. Now, the movie War Games, in which there was a scenario by which nuclear weapons could accidentally be launched and not called back, bothered him. And when he came back to Washington that week, he asked his military people, well, is this something that could really happen? And he mentioned it at a cabinet meeting and mentioned it with congressional leaders. That stayed on his mind for a couple of days. The idea that despite all the efforts and all the safeguards, somehow or another, a computer could go haywire and launch nuclear weapons that could never be called back, that bothered him a little bit. But every other movie that I write about and that we saw, whether it was Hellcats of the Navy or Ferris Bueller's Day Off or Oh God, Book 2 or 9 to 5 or On Golden Pond or any of those, so many others, whatever they were, they enjoyed them. They laughed at them if they were funny, or they appreciated the scenery from, for example, out of Africa, or they had fond memories of Bedtime for Bonzo. But they weren't any movie, they weren't like people would go to a movie and say, wow, I've been thinking about it all weekend and I need to see it again. And that just wasn't them. They went to be entertained, to take a couple hours off, to exhale, and to just, when the movie was over, the movie was over.
Okay. Take a few moments to describe their reaction as a couple to a few of the movies that you found most interesting.
Well, they were bothered by 9 to 5 because of the scenes that depicted drug use. Now, you have to remember this was back in the 80s, and marijuana wasn't legal anywhere. And, of course, Mrs. Reagan had quite a campaign against drug abuse, and that bothered them because they didn't feel it was necessary. The president wrote in his diary that it actually made him mad, that they glamorized it. So gratuitous drug use or sex or violence bothered them a lot. They both didn't like that. They both loved the scenery in Out of Africa, were just struck by the cinematography. They were very amused by Ferris Bueller's Day Off and Back to the Future and Oh God, Book 2, because they were entertaining, clean comedies. They were wholesome, they were fun, they didn't require an incredible amount of deep pondering. There were no scenes from which you would cringe, and they just enjoyed those. They especially enjoyed the Ferris Bueller's picture with Matthew Broderick at the parade in downtown Chicago singing Danke Shane and some of his antics. They were fun, they were entertaining, and they would say, now that's how movies should be. They were just, you went and you had a good time and enjoyed it and had a few laughs and relaxed. Those were the kinds of movies. They also liked big red, white, and blue, robust movies about the military, Top Gun, or things of that kind where, where the Americans beat the Russians. He liked those kind of red, white, and blue movies as well.
Okay. Well, I was going to ask you, what was one of your favorite stories that came out of one of those nights when all three of you watched these movies together? Or what was one of your most incredible experience just sitting there with them and watching?
Well, it actually, one of the things is the Reagans never took their eyes from the screen. The minute the movie started, their eyes were glued to that screen, and they watched the movie from the beginning to the end. And the minute the movie ended, the president would look at his watch to see how long it had run. He was a student of film in the sense that he always wanted to know the running time. That's his old Hollywood in him. Well, the story that I remember most was about a movie that I saw with them, and I don't remember which one it was. There's this chapter in there where Red Dawn and a couple of the other communist-related movies were in there, and there was a movie in there where some of the people in the movie had converted over to communism for one reason or another, and at the end of the movie, after each movie, we would stand up and go over to the fireplace and talk a little bit about the movie. And I said something, and I don't know what it was that I said or why I said it, that sounded similar to what the communist sympathizers were saying in the movie. And the president said to me, "Well, Mark, you sound just like the fellows we just heard back in the movie over there." And everybody laughed, and I said, "My gosh, the President of the United States just painted me red." And everybody thought that was everybody laughed, and we were all amused by it. Well, I didn't give it a second thought. I don't know what I said, but something along the lines of, "Well, sir, I think the theory of the communists was that it did away with the class system, and each according to something stupid and all." But he picked right up on it, and I said, "We painted me red." So and everybody laughed. I didn't give it a second thought. The next day, that was a Friday night. The next day at noon, the president did his radio address, which he insisted on doing live from Camp David every Saturday at 12:06 from that conference room that I mentioned in that big Laurel Lodge. And everything was fine. Everybody was in a good mood, and we had the usual interaction that we had during the radio speech and so forth. And he said to everybody, "Well, I'll see you tonight for the movie." So we went back at 8 o'clock, 8:15 for the movie as usual on Saturday night. And he said, when we all gathered there at the fireplace before the movie, he said, "Say, listen, last night I said something silly about Mark having to do with the communists and the other movies." He said, "I know he doesn't feel that way. Why, he's part of the family." And I said, "Well, thank you, sir. I really wasn't bothered by it, but I sure appreciate your mentioning it." And which I thought was very nice of him to do. And I later, after the movie, I called Mrs. Reagan aside and I said, "You know, he didn't have to do that. To be honest with you, I didn't give it a second thought. And by the way, he could have done it at the radio speech this afternoon if he was bothered." She said, "Oh no, we talked about that. And Ronnie thought it was very important that he say that in front of the whole group, because that's where he said what he did last night." And I thought, very few people, let alone a president of the United States, would give that much thought to what was the most casual, offhand thing. But that was Reagan. That was Reagan. And there was no stagecraft and no press and no anything around. He did that because that's who he was.
Okay, there is one photograph that I found particularly fascinating in the book because it's someone who is arguably more famous worldwide than President Reagan. Who is
Errol
that?
Flynn?
Huh?
Errol Flynn?
Wasn't Errol Flynn. No, I'm talking about of you.
Of me?
Yeah. It's the very last photograph, isn't it?
Oh, the fellow, the Neverland fellow.
Yes.
Yes. Well, there's a picture.
How did that happen?
I guess
It's a photo of Mark
I have
with Michael
pictures of
Jackson.
me. I have a picture of me with Michael Jackson, a picture of me with the Pope. So you got good and evil in this book, I guess. But Michael Jackson came to the White House for an award from the Secretary of Transportation, to something to do with safe driving. And Michael Jackson was at the peak of his popularity. This was the days of the glittery gloves and the fancy suit and the moonwalk and all that. Well, he came to the White House, and of course everybody who worked there had to be part of it, so the event was moved to the South Lawn so everybody could be there. But before he went out there with the Reagans, people gave him a tour, wanted to give him a tour of the White House. He had never been there. And I found out that he was going to have a tour of the White House and that he was going to end up in the library. So I managed to pre-position myself in the library, and I had with me a set of books, official tour guide books in bound leather, very fancy set, to present to him, but I made sure that there was a White House photographer present. So I ended up with a picture of myself and Michael Jackson with these White House tour books. And it seemed like such a coup at the time, and now, given what has been going on, I almost wish I had not had that picture in the book, because the public opinion of Michael Jackson has changed a little bit.
Changed a little bit.
Since then. But that was one of those days when people in the White House were literally saying, "Excuse me, Mr. President, is Michael Jackson around? And would you mind moving out of the picture here?" You've never seen everybody. You would think of the White House was blasé, but that was one of the very few times when everyone was starstruck, and I was just as bad as the people who worked in our office.
Mark, and this is a very challenging question, I'm sure, but if you had one or even two really special stories about the president that you would like to tell and recount to our audience tonight.
Well, one story, they both are, they're in here, but they both reminded me that Reagan was smarter than I thought, that he got it when I wasn't sure he would. One was, he had written his autobiography called An American Life, which he really didn't want to do. He referred to it as a monkey on his back, and we hired a writer to help him with it named Bob Lindsay, but ultimately he wrote most of it himself by hand. Lindsay and he would do interviews. Lindsay would type a chapter. President Reagan would say thank you, and then he'd rewrite the whole thing by his hand. And he couldn't be done with it soon enough. He viewed it as a burden. But he got it done. He knew he had to. And fortunately, he had kept a diary, so it was not easy, but it wasn't as hard as it might have been. But he did keep his handwritten diary, which acted as the basis for his autobiography. Well, the book was done, and we arranged for Barbara Walters to come out and interview him as part of the publicity for book sales. And Mrs. Reagan and Barbara Walters had a very nice social relationship, and she was very interested that this interview go well. Mrs. Reagan wanted every interview to go well. She always wanted Ronnie to do well and be prepared and look good, but she was particularly interested in this interview, and she knew that he really wasn't into his book. So, the day before, 2 days before, I think Barbara was set to come out to Los Angeles, we were on a trip somewhere, and it was a fairly long trip. It was probably to Chicago, because there were a lot of hours on the airplane. It was a little bitty private plane. He was a former president. And we had some advance copies of the book. And I was at the house, and she called me over and said, "Mark, you make sure Ronnie sees this before his interview with Barbara." And she handed me an advance copy of the book. I said, "Okay, no problem." She said, No. You make sure he sees this before he sits down with Barbara. And she was very clear, and she was very firm, and it was, they were orders. So I dutifully put the book in my briefcase, and we fly away, and he does his speech, spend the night in the hotel, and the next morning we're on the plane to come back to California, and we had 3 or 4 hours, which is why I think it was probably Chicago. And the plane takes off, and he's seated. The way this plane was configured was they had a table, and they had 2 captain's chairs, one on either side, and then on the other side of the aisle were couches or bench things, and a couple agents and I and one other staff member, I think, or maybe not even, sat over there, and the president sat by himself at the table as a desk, and he did some reading. He read magazines or worked on a speech or looked out the window. He never napped, ever, on the plane. And we let him be. We gave him his space as best you could on a small airplane. Well, I knew that I had a mission. So I took my briefcase and I put it on the table and opened it up and took the book out, and he looked up from what he was reading and didn't acknowledge me. And I said, "Mr. President, yes, Sir, yes, what is it? Which was very out of character because, he was almost always willing to chat. I said, sir, and I held up the book. You see your book here, right? Yes, I see it. What about it? Oh, this is not going to go well. There's no way this man was going to read this book over the next 4 hours. And I said, are you looking at it? Yes, I'm looking at it. What about it? And I said, well, sir, you see this book. Is that right? Yes, Mark, I told you I'd see it. I said, okay. So if a lady in Bel Air, California asks, did you see your book on the trip home, honey? You're going to say what? Yes. I said, it's okay, let's just make sure we understand each other. It's okay, I'm going to tell that lady in Bel Air, the president saw his book on the trip home, right? Yeah, I've seen the book. And I said, okay, sir, thanks very much. Put it back in my briefcase, went back and sat down. And he winked. And then, so we fly, and he went about his business. And then, just as soon as we landed, before he got off the plane, he always got off first, and the Secret Service would drive him home, and we'd go out and get our cars. I said, Mr. President, in case anybody asks, you've seen your book, right? I sure have. And he walked off, and sure enough, she said, honey, did you see your book? Yep, Mark showed it to me. And hadn't read a page of it. And fortunately, the interview went well. But I wasn't sure whether he would get it. But he did, and he played along, and he knew. And the other story that I would tell you, which is also written about, one Saturday we were in Washington. We hadn't gone to Camp David, and the president's personal aide, Jim Kuhn, who's a friend of Hugh's and mine, would have me fill in for him on Saturdays so he could be home with his young children, because the president would come to the Oval Office to do the radio address. He did it live from wherever he was. He insisted on that because he's an old radio man, and he just felt it was important. He could easily have recorded it, but he wanted to do it live. He liked to do it live. So on Saturdays, if we were in Washington or at the ranch or at Camp David, he would do it live. Well, Jim asked me to fill in for him as the president's personal aide on the Saturday, this particular Saturday. And what that meant was going to the residence part of the White House, at the elevator, and walking with the president from the residence to the Oval Office, making sure everything was set up properly, being on hand. If there was any paperwork that he needed to see, make sure he saw it, and then escort him back to the residence for the day. It's not as if he couldn't get there on his own, but you staffed him in that way. Well, it so happened on this particular Saturday, there was a letter or two that they needed him to sign, I think to a congressman or something, and Jim said, it'll be on my desk. So when you go get him, make sure you get the folder and have him sign the letters, and then take it back down to Darvin's office, or Retdov, the staff secretary's office, because they need to dispatch these letters. I said, okay, fine. So sure enough, the folder was there, that said for the president's signature. I went and met him at the elevator, walked over, he did the radio address in the Oval Office, and I thought, rather than have him sign these letters at his desk, there are people around. There's military people, there's communications people, there's people from the radio network. I don't know what the content of these letters are. I'll have him do it when he gets back to the residence. So we go over to the residence, we ride upstairs. He had an office, a private office off of the bedroom on the second floor of the White House. And he went there, and I said, sir, I need to get you to sign these letters. He said, fine. I gave him a pen, much like I just did to Bill a few minutes ago, and signs the letter. I said, have a nice weekend. Thank you very much. I took the letters back, put them where I was supposed to. I went home, and that was the rest of the weekend. Well, Monday, this was Saturday. Monday at about 10 o'clock, Jim Kuhn, the president's personal aide, called me. We had a direct line between our offices. The personal aide is what they now call the body man, who attends to the president wherever he goes, and who has an office immediately adjacent to the Oval Office. He called me on the private line and said he wants to see you. I said, yeah, I'm sure he does. Yeah, right, tell him I'll be there when I can. Reagan never sent for anybody. That was not his style. He would never come in and say, yeah, have Bill Lacey come in. Can you get this one in here? I need to see so-and-so. It just wasn't demanding that way. He would say, well, maybe, if you get a chance to ask. But I said, I didn't believe Jim. I thought he was just, scamming me. People did that all the time. They had jokes. So I didn't go. And then he called an hour later. He said, no, he really did. He asked again to see you. I said, seriously? Yeah. I thought, well, I couldn't imagine why. Why would he need to see me about anything? So I took my time. A little while later, I put my jacket on. It was hanging on the back of my office door, and I went up to the Oval Office, which is just down the hall, and Jim wasn't there. But Kathy Osborne was the president's secretary, and I said, Jim said he wants to see me. And she said, he does? And she didn't know anything about it. I said, yeah. She said, I don't know anything about it. I'll ask him. So she goes into the Oval Office and closes the door behind her and comes out a minute later and said, he does. And I didn't know if she had that reaction because she didn't know about it or because it was so unusual. So I said, okay. And I thought, can't imagine. So I walk in there, and he's at his desk, and I think he was having lunch, a bowl of soup on a tray or some such thing, and reading the paper. He said, oh, Mark, come on in. I said, sir, you wanted to see me? Yes, come on in. And he opens the drawer to his desk, and he said, now, about those letters that you had me sign on Saturday, I thought, oh, God, I must have screwed it up. It must have been wrong, maybe. I had all these visions flashing. I don't know why. And he opens the drawer, and he takes out a pen. He said, you let me use your pen to sign these letters, and I didn't know if you needed it for any reason or if it was special to you. And he said, I was going to call you about it, but I didn't want you to have to come back to the office, but here it is. And it was one of those felt tips that you would buy for, I think they called it a flare pen or some such thing that you would buy. I said, no, sir, that's okay. Thank you very much for it. Well, you bet. Have a nice day. And I should have kept it. I didn't have the presence of mind. But that was Reagan. It just never occurred to him that he was better or more important or unworthy of your attention. It just that was him. And the fact that he said, I thought about calling you, but I didn't want you to have to come back in. And seriously, who thinks like that?
Yeah. You have some amazing stories. They're in the book. You can pick it up, and Mark's going to be signing books after tonight. I have one more question, then we're going to open it up to your Q&A. So if you've got a question, be thinking about what you want to ask, and raise your hand and get the attention. And Alex, you're doing this too, along with Alec, right? We got these two young men. Get their attention with your hand, and they'll bring a microphone over. And please wait until you get a microphone in front of you before you ask the question. But Mark, my last question, because you and I both did this, and presumably Hugh did this at some point, but if you're a young person and you're wanting to work for a president of the United States, what advice would you give to young people about how to go about doing that?
You mean if they're not their child?
Yes.
Oh.
Is there anybody in particular you were talking about there, Mark?
Yes, Maureen Reagan. Well, there's a number of ways that you can get in to the White House, but I think for a young person, the path of least resistance would be to work on the campaign. That's what most of the people that I know did. Now, obviously, it's a gamble to pick the right horse, although I picked Connally, and he didn't win, and then Reagan did, and everything worked out great. But when you're a young person, and I was mentioning this to you, people walk into the White House press office, and they see all these kids at these desks, and you're in the West Wing of the White House. You're down the hall from the Oval Office. And they said, my God, they're in their 20s. There's these kids. Well, the reason for that is because they were from the campaign. And they all were interested in politics, and they worked for basically nothing because they could as 20-somethings, and they didn't have any obligations. Some of them were even interns. And then the campaign won, and you had to staff the White House. You had to staff the government. And that the easiest way to get swept up into a White House job is to come in from the winning campaign. Otherwise, you are then in the process of having to send a resume in with hundreds, if not thousands, of people who want spots. Now, you can get them, obviously, if you have a relationship with a donor or a member of Congress or somebody else politically connected. there are ways to do that. But for young people who say, I really want to work in the White House, the best way, the easiest way, is still, to this day, a campaign. Because if you look at most of the people, even in this White House, they are campaign veterans. And so it will be with whoever succeeds this president.
Okay. We're going to open up to your questions. If you got a question, raise your hand. We got one back there.
Who selected the movies to be seen, and how many people were in the studio watching?
Mrs. Reagan made the selections. Sometimes she talked to her husband about it, sometimes she didn't. It wasn't, she knew his tastes. And, but usually, a list would be sent up to them, and it would have her check marks on it. And she would get recommendations from friends in Hollywood or other social friends. They also read the paper. One of the reasons they wanted to see movies that were popular, because they couldn't very well go to the neighborhood theater. But they wanted to be in touch with pop culture, and they wanted to know what the country was seeing and what people were talking about. Plus, she would hear from, her friends in California elsewhere, this is a great movie, you would enjoy it, or Mike Deaver or others on the staff would recommend. But usually it was Mrs. Reagan who made the selection. Sometimes their kids made recommendations. In the living room in Aspen Lodge, watching the movie with the President, Mrs. Reagan, was the personal aide, the President's doctor, the President's helicopter pilot, sometimes the senior Secret Service agent in charge, sometimes the camp commander, and me. An occasional spouse as well. Depends who was up at camp that weekend. Just a handful of people.
And how were the movies shown? Because we talked about that earlier, and it might surprise people.
Well, they
a
were
little
shown
bit.
reel to reel. They were on a projector, like in a movie theater. In the dining room of Aspen Lodge, the living room, dining room was L-shaped. And in the dining room, at the very back of the dining room, there were two nautical prints. Camp David is a Navy facility. Its technical name is Naval Support Facility Thermont, NSF. Thermont is, if you ever look up a military directory, it's staffed by the U.S. Navy and Marines for security. It's a presidential retreat. It's actually an emergency relocation place that in Aspen Lodge, there is literally a trap door. And in the event of a nuclear circumstance, one of the places the president would go would be to Camp David. But its normal function is as a retreat within half an hour's helicopter ride of Washington. It's maintained by the U.S. Navy. Well, so there are nautical appointments throughout. And in the back of the dining room, on the wall, are two nautical prints. When it was time for the movie, somebody would come and take those off the wall, and they would reveal windows to a projection room in which was a Navy enlisted person who had been trained in how to operate. Remember the big reel-to-reels like you'd see in the theater, and you'd have the golf ball so you knew when to go to the next row. And he would project those, and there would be speakers in the room. There would be a screen that would come down from the ceiling. The lights would be dimmed, and the movie would be shown. And every once in a while, they would have some trouble with the film, and there was two occasions, I'll tell you. One, they would come in cans. You know how movies would come in those big silvers. Well, one weekend, one movie, the Navy guy, there were 3 reels, and he forgot one of them. And the movie ended, and the president looked at his watch, and he said, and he didn't say anything, and the camp commander, the guy came out, "Oh, Commander, I've done a terrible thing," and he told him, and the commander said, "Well, the only thing to do is to own up to it, you know." And so the commander said, "Well, Mr. President, I need to tell you, sir, that unfortunately we missed one of the reels, and that's why." He said, "Well, you know, I thought that when I noticed that it ended half an hour earlier." And he said, "Sir, if you'd like to go back, we're prepared." No, I know how it ends. But he couldn't quite. He said, "I thought so." And then, somehow or another, the movies were shown in the wrong order. And the Reagans knew, but he didn't say a word, because he didn't want to make the projectionist feel bad. But that, you know, they weren't cassettes, they weren't CDs or DVDs or Netflix. They were movies, and then they were sent back in the metal cans at the end of the weekend.
Mark has mentioned, and I don't usually interject like this, but I have to on this one. You mentioned a couple times the president's sense of time.
Yes.
And how good he was at that. I remember one time I was recording I was just actually present because I was responsible for all of his TV ads for U.S. House candidates in 1982. And he was recording these ad after ad after ad, and I believe Mark Good was the guy who produced
Yeah,
those,
exactly.
and I was always there to make sure the names got pronounced correctly. And he did one take, and the producer says to him, Mr. President, this is a 30-second commercial. So he looked at the producer and he says, so you need me to talk about 28 seconds. And the producer says, yes, sir, if you can get it down to 28. And the president says, well, how long was that? And the producer says it was 31. He says, let me do it again. And he does it again, and the producer times it 28 seconds exactly. So, next question back here.
Slight change in mood here, but what was your response to the Watergate scandal? Like, how did you feel about that? Were there any nods to anything going on, or were you expecting anything?
You mean around Contra? That was the Reagan scandal. Watergate was Nixon. I was a kid.
My bad.
I said, no problem. No, the Iran-Contra scandal is the one, and it's a very interesting question because it was the only time that I actually saw Ronald Reagan depressed. And he wasn't depressed, interestingly enough, unfortunately, he wasn't depressed because of what Ollie North and John Poindexter and the others had done. He was pissed off about that. He was depressed because people didn't believe him. And he had never been not believed, because even the sharpest Reagan critics said he's an honest guy. Integrity was not a thing with which Reagan had a problem. Nobody ever thought he was lying throughout his political career. In the picture business, as governor of California, as a candidate, Reagan was always viewed as an honest guy. Nobody thought he was, that he told things that weren't true. And so in Iran-Contra, when he would go out there and say, I didn't know what they were up to, I didn't approve the diversion of funds, and I didn't know about it, and poll after poll showed that people didn't believe him, he was very depressed by that and down by it and bothered by it and didn't know what to do about it. He said, I just can't understand why it is that people don't believe me when I'm telling the truth. And that, I think, for him was the hardest part of Iran-Contra. He didn't want to believe at first that these men in whom he had placed trust and who were military heroes, so he had a natural affection for them, Colonel North and Admiral Poindexter and so forth, had done these things. He didn't want to believe it, but he did. I mean, he was a realist. Once that niece and others sat him down and said, look, this happened, and here's the proof of it. It was arms for hostages, and it shouldn't have happened. Well, then he accepted it and did what needed to be done. But the worst part of Iran-Contra for him was the fact that he wasn't believed. And that's why, interestingly enough, the defining speech was 32 years ago last week, or actually 32 years ago Monday. What's today, Thursday? 32 years ago Monday was when he finally said, it happened on my watch, I accept responsibility. The words he needed to say to be able to move on. Because until he said them, nobody was going to let him off the hook.
Okay. We got a question right here.
Yeah, this is a little twist on your impact, movies that impact him. Did he have a favorite movie? Or did he have any movies that maybe he saw more than once? Thing like that?
Well, I think if you were to ask him, he would probably say that Hellcats of the Navy was his favorite movie because it was the only one he was in with Nancy. I think the one he enjoyed making the most was the Knute Rockne All-American story, because it was the defining role. It's the role that gave him the nickname, the Gipper. And the interesting thing, I mentioned this before, when I was researching this book, I went back and saw that movie again. I watched a number of these movies again. And I watched the Knute Rockne All-American story, and I was surprised by how brief Reagan's appearance was in it, how small his role really was. I mean, everybody really describes it as the Gipper movie. Well, it isn't the Gipper movie. It's the Canute Rockne. And by the way, it is Canute. It's not Newt like the salamander or the speaker. And Reagan made a point of whenever anybody would say Newt, he said, well, I have to tell you, it's Canute. But I think that the name stuck with him and the character stuck with him. I think that was the one he had the most fun making. But because he knew, they knew, so many people in Hollywood, whether it was Henry Fonda or George Burns or Errol Flynn or any of those people, and were friends with almost all of them, Jimmy Stewart, it would be hard to get them to say, I like this movie more than anybody else's. They liked most of the movies they saw. But I think those two would probably have an emotional connection to him.
Okay, we got a question here. Nancy?
Yes, I understand the president watched the day after, and I wondered if they had watched it at Camp David.
That was a movie about
Is that the
nuclear
morning after
warfare.
about the nuclear?
It's the day after. It was filmed around
Filmed
here.
in large part in Kansas.
The ABC
Yes, television movie.
television movie. I don't remember if they watched it at Camp David. I do know that he was bothered by that. That was very disturbing to him, and he wrote about it. He wrote about it in his diary as well. There is a company. It's interesting you should mention that movie. There is a production company based in Australia which is making a documentary about that movie and its impact on our country. And one of the reasons that movie and War Games and others had the impact or brief impact that it did was because Reagan was absolutely horrified by the notion that the Russians and the Americans could literally wipe each other off the face of the earth with nuclear weapons. And that's what underpinned his entire approach to Gorbachev and the INF Treaty, which is since, as you know, been suspended, I guess. But those kinds of movies where the realities of the horror of nuclear war were ones that bothered him a little bit. Those were not quite the Ferris Bueller's Day Off or Oh God, Book 2 or Back to the Future with Jane Wyman as First Lady, which was another interesting thing to watch with Nancy Reagan in the room. Those kinds of movies made him a little more real for him.
Okay, we got a question. Okay, we'll go here first and then here.
You have emphasized the kindness of the president.
Yes.
The Iranians waited until Reagan took office before releasing our diplomatic hostages. The first big event with the hostages released, as I recall, had his bitter opponent, President Carter, in attendance.
Yes.
Do you remember anything about that that's of interest?
I do. They were freed during the luncheon that immediately followed his swearing in. He made the announcement that the planes had cleared Iranian airspace when he was still at the Capitol. And he asked President Carter to go and greet them at, I don't know if it was Ramstein Air Base or wherever it is in Germany. They always come into Germany whenever I thought it was Ramstein Air Force Base. And he asked President Carter, because he had worked so hard to free them up until the very last minute, and thought it was only fair that he do that. That was something that Reagan thought, Jimmy Carter deserved. And when he had all the hostages to the White House, it was a very emotional moment for him. There are those who think, you talk about Reagan being kind. It was a very kind gesture of them, but there are those who think that the reason the Iranians freed them is because they were afraid of him and that they didn't know what he would do. But yeah, I do remember that. It happened on Inauguration Day, and he made sure that Carter had the role that he thought he deserved.
Okay, I have a question right here.
Do they watch holiday movies like at Christmas time, It's a Wonderful Life, Frankenstein around Halloween?
No. They've watched It's a Wonderful Life, but they didn't watch holiday movies per se. I wanted them to watch Toy Story. Is that the one, Toy Story? There was some movie in the 80s where the kid got his tongue stuck on a Christmas Story, yeah. But they didn't, but a wonderful life they watched.
Okay, do we have any other questions tonight? Other questions? Okay. Oh, gotcha. This will be the last one.
Were you in the White House when the assassination attempt happened?
Yes.
And was the confusion, and what was that like?
Well, I don't know, because I left. I'll tell you exactly what happened. The president and Jim Brady and the others who were with him that day left to go to the event at the Washington Hilton Hotel. I had at that point a counterpart by the name of David Prosperi, who was the other assistant press secretary who sat in the office next to mine, and he went that day. I stayed back at the White House. Larry speaks. We alternated in-town events, David and I did. And he called and said, there's been a shooting and Jim is down and they're taking the president to the hospital. At that very moment, I left my office in the White House. I went to Jim Brady's office, which was down the hall and up 2 stairs. I grabbed his secretary, a woman named Sally McElroy, who has since passed away, and we got a White House car and sped out to Arlington. They lived in Arlington, I think, and picked up Sarah Brady to take her to the hospital. So I wasn't in the White House. I was in a car, and we picked up Sarah at the house. So it was Sarah Brady, Sally McElroy, and a family friend named Otto Wolf came as well. And Sarah hadn't known at that moment that Jim had been hit in the head. So we were in the car, and I don't remember who told her where the wound was, and that bothered her obviously very much because she knew the implications of that, especially for a man like Jim Brady. And then we hightailed it to a George Washington University hospital and got there very shortly after the president and Jim did. In fact, they were still in the emergency room when we got there, and Sarah was immediately whisked off to be with Mrs. Reagan and to be with her husband in the emergency room. And I remember seeing that. I didn't know the president had been shot. No one knew. They said they were taking him there as a precaution, and then they realized in the car when he spit up the blood that something wasn't right. But we knew that Brady had been shot, and Tim McCarthy and Officer Delahanty were wounded. We didn't know. And so when I got to the president, to the GW hospital and saw the president on a gurney, I said to somebody, "What the?" And they said, "Well, he took a bullet in the lung." And then I stayed at the hospital the rest of that day and night. And they didn't think Jim Brady would make it, but obviously he did. So I wasn't there in that room when, Alexander Haig and others did what they did. I was at the hospital, which was a bit of a different kind of confusion. But I heard about it and saw it on TV. But we were there, David and I spent the night in the hospital.
Okay, any other questions? We have one last question. Okay, you go first, sir. We're gonna go here, and this is the last question.
You've mentioned Errol Flynn twice.
Yes.
Did the president like watching old movies where he played with Errol Flynn, like Santa Fe Trail that took place in Kansas territory?
Yeah, he had a thing about Errol Flynn, and he thought Errol Flynn had a bit of an ego, and he didn't like that very much in people generally. But someone asked him, "Are you afraid of Gorbachev?" And he said, "Afraid of Gorbachev? I've been in movies with Errol Flynn."
Was it because Errol Flynn got Olivia de Havilland in Santa Fe Trail and Reagan didn't?
There's a picture in here of me giving him a T-shirt. Actually, it's the only picture in this book that was taken inside their cabin at Camp David. It's a very unusual thing because photography was not usually allowed in there. But
very funny.
I had a T-shirt. I saw a T-shirt that said, "Mikhail Gorbachev, tougher than Errol Flynn," and I gave it to him at Camp David because he had a thing about Errol Flynn, and he tells a story that Errol Flynn had to be the tallest man in every scene, and Reagan wanted to just screw with him a little bit, And so they were all standing somewhere, and Reagan kicked up some of the dust so that he would end up being taller than Errol Flynn in the group photo. And he got caught on it. He liked those kinds of movies, but he had mixed feelings. I mean, he recognized his talent as an actor and and how handsome a man that he was, but he thought he was a little full of himself.
Well, thank you very much.
You bet.
But Errol got Olivia de Havilland, and
Yes.
Ronald Reagan lost her in that
Well,
movie.
but he got Nancy, which he would.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
Okay, we're going to take one last question right here.
You mentioned President Reagan's happiness and optimism a lot. Did he carry that with him even through the difficulties of his presidency, say, when his negotiation with Gorbachev? Was he still an optimistic, happy person throughout all of his difficulties in office?
Always, always. He never presumed bad. He never presumed the worst. He was reluctant to believe bad things or that about people. He wasn't naive, but some would say he might be close in the sense that his first, second, and third thoughts were not that somebody had ill motive or that somebody was using him for their own agenda or that things won't work out. He always walked on the sunny side and was cautiously optimistic and felt that tomorrow will be brighter. He always did. He never let himself get down, except, as I had mentioned before with regard to Iran-Contra, when he went through a period of time when it just genuinely depressed him that people didn't believe because he didn't know what to do about it. That frustrated him. But for the most part, he was happy and optimistic. Listen, he could get mad and he could, get annoyed. And there are incidents in here of when he would get mad at people and what he would get mad about. But he was not an angry, unhappy person. That was very much the exception rather than the rule. He was an extraordinarily well-adjusted human being who was very comfortable in his own skin, not obsessed with his ego. He understood how to communicate with people who he would never meet and convey big messages to large numbers of people. He understood the value of a gesture, whether it be a wave or a smile or a salute or a wink. And he never really took himself seriously. He took his work seriously, and he respected what he was allowed to do, but he was not given to brood, and he was not given to, think about him and his place in history. It just wasn't, the introspective stuff wasn't him.
Okay, well, we're going to conclude. I'm going to remind everybody the book is for sale. It'll be out front. And Mark is going to be signing copies, and I'm going to get one. And hopefully a bunch of you will get them too. But at any rate, please join me in thanking Mark for coming tonight.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We appreciate your coming out. I hope that we'll see you for the next two discussions about books in this particular series. So thank you for being with us tonight.